Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. On the episode today, we have Joel Bouchard. Joel, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
It is very much my pleasure. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So, I do quite a few things. I'm the production manager for a manufacturing facility that makes pieces for the power grid. I'm a doctoral student in psychology. I'm a podcaster. I have a philosophy podcast, From Nowhere to Nothing. I'm a musician, so I play 7 different instruments. I've got a recording studio. Kind of put some things together, release them. So I think I've got 5 albums out now, along with a bunch of singles and EPs. And I paint and write. I've got a book that's currently getting edited, so I'm hoping that'll come out this summer, along with 3D printing and a bunch of other hobbies. So just do a little bit of everything.
You got a lot going on. You're a busy man.
Yeah. Yep.
And what would you say your passion is to speak about?
I think it comes back to philosophy, but more specifically, being a learner. Learning new things. I always like to be doing something new. My most recent thing is I'm on the board of trustees for my local village, right? So I'm trying to learn village government. After we get off the podcast here, I've got to go down and learn about budgets and, appropriations and all that kind of stuff. So I think being a learner is good for several reasons. One, it keeps you young, keeps you growing, but it also keeps you humble because it truly, the more you know, the more you realize just how much you don't know, right? And you get very used to failing and making mistakes whenever you're learning something new. So I think you know, always being a learner is a good thing.
Well, I enjoy definition of terms. So, and this is a question on your profile. So, for you, what would you say? What is philosophy?
Yeah, so philosophy, right? It's what I like to tell people when they ask me about it is I always tell them it's your favorite topic, you just don't know it yet, right? Because I didn't know what it was really until I took a philosophy class, right, my freshman year of college. And okay, it's something to do with dusty books and guys with big beards who are mad at the world or something. But it's really not that at all, right? Philosophy is um the the reasons and the justifications for why you believe what you believe, right? Um it's not just what you believe, right? Because you can believe lots of things and not have any good reason to other than somebody told you to, right? Which is probably one of the biggest problems with our modern society is um just accepting knowledge as something that is authoritative without doing any work on your own part. But it's that process. Logic, syllogisms, the ability to really look at something critically, right? Go, okay, well, this is what I believe, but why do I believe it? Do I believe it because I have a good reason to, or is it a bias of some kind? Is it a blind spot? Is it something that is negative that I should be actually putting some effort into thinking about without just wholeheartedly accepting it? So yeah, that's sort of the long answer is philosophy is the reason why we believe what we believe.
In relation to this topic, I don't know whether it's specifically a social media problem or just a problem in general. I find that when you have some, I don't know, my perception, some philosophical training, dealing with the types of things that going on in society right now, it's kind of frustrating. So, do you feel that because you mentioned all of those things in your definition, do you feel that also, or is there a way that you can sort of cope in that sense?
Yeah, I guess there's two fronts, right? I think that on the social media front or the media front in general, there's definitely frustration, right? I don't like reading through the news. I don't like scrolling or doing any of that stuff because I read headlines and I go, man, what is wrong with the world, right? But in most of my face-to-face interactions with people, I don't feel that way, right? And I talk with people across the spectrum, right? People who are far right, people who are far left. And what you discover when you actually talk with people, and if you're actually trying to understand what it is you're talking about, is that usually you can have a civil conversation with almost anybody, right? Sometimes people will come right out of the gate and say something that's way in left field, right? And I think that a philosophical mindset resists the urge to say, "Oh, well, you're an idiot." It just makes you go, "Okay, well, but why do you believe that?" Right? It's that state of wanting to be the learner, wanting to be curious, wanting to explore something a little bit deeper, and starting from the position that you don't know everything, right? I don't know everything. So maybe you know something I don't. So tell me, why do you think that is? What's your reasons for that? And if you, what I found is really you only have to ask that question 2 or 3 times before you can then raise an objection to somebody. And rather than getting upset and stomping off or yelling at you, they'll actually say, "Oh, okay, well, yeah, I guess I haven't thought about that way." So I think, yeah, the frustration, it's two fronts, right? It's what you see in the media and on social media, and then it's what's actually happening out in the world. And I feel two different ways about it, I guess.
That is a good distinction, and it's good to be reminded of that. Have you ever, using the Socratic method, have you ever changed someone's mind on a big topic or a big issue?
Um, I can't think of any examples. I know that it happens a lot, but usually the way it happens is very much the way that it's written by Plato, right? Where you'll have a discussion and you'll start asking questions and asking questions. And then when it becomes obvious that somebody's position's falling apart, usually rather than accepting your position, that's just sort of the end of the discussion. They go, "Oh, all right, well," and they begrudgingly stomp off, right? Because
It's
it's a
kind of an
well-known
evasion.
yeah, it's a well-known psychological phenomenon called cognitive dissonance, right? Where when we are presented with evidence that's contrary to our closely held beliefs, rather than accepting that evidence, usually we wholesale reject that evidence and cling closer to our flawed beliefs and invent new stories to support them. But it takes time to invent those new stories. So in the moment when you're confronted with this, "Oh, shoot, the thing that I believed didn't work," rather than moving to the thing that has evidence behind it, you're gonna go back and kind of retool your own theories. So that's why I always believe that it's good to not start with theories, right? Do not subscribe to ideologies of any kind. As a matter of fact, a question I get asked a lot is, "So as a philosopher, what's your core beliefs, right? What are the things that you stand by?" I said, "There's only one, and that's that I'm always open to change," right? If you're not open to change, then at some level you believe you have all of the answers, and that's just always a dangerous place to be as a fallible human being.
And have you had any instances where you've done that method on yourself and then, made a big change in one of your beliefs or positions on things?
Yeah, I think it happens all the time, right? And maybe, we don't think of it as being in a big way in the moment, but it does have the ability to change your life over time. Um, I remember one time being at work probably about 10 years ago and on lunch and looking into my lunch box and seeing, some little Debbie snacks and some bags of chips and stuff and going, "Wait a minute, like what am I doing here?" Right? I'm in good shape, but that's probably because I'm a young person and not because my diet is healthy, right? Which means that the clock is ticking. This can't go on forever. So I have to make some changes, right? So that's a pretty simple argument, right? You don't need many steps to go, "Oh, okay, well, I can look at the population of humans and I can see what they eat and how they age and how things play out." And not a lot of them that are in good shape in middle age or old age are the ones chowing down on little Debbie snacks and bags of chips, right? Most of these guys have healthy diets. And so, yeah, and I think that it's just the process of examining each part of your life and making those decisions. And if you do them little by little, it doesn't seem drastic and it doesn't seem overwhelming. And it doesn't even really seem like something you have to work at if you have a sound reason for doing it. But over time, it can make drastic impacts in your life.
Well, I'm very interested to know. I wouldn't normally delve into, what should we say, interesting topics. That's how I'll label them with many guests. But because of your, I know, because of your outlook or perhaps your training, lack of a better term, I'm interested to know what of the popular philosophical topics where you've looked into and you've actually come to some, I don't know if conclusion is the right term because you're open to good arguments, right? But what are the topics that you've looked into which you feel like you've got a good premise or conclusion on?
Yeah, that's probably one of the most difficult questions anybody could ask me, right? Because the name of the podcast is From Nowhere to Nothing, and it's a pretty good descriptor of how a lot of the shows go. Usually we look at a one-word topic like God or time, and we spend an hour talking about it. The first part looking at the historical thought that philosophers have had on it, and then the middle section, trying to make sense of that thought in combined with our contemporary experiences and our current thinking, and then the last half asking speculative questions about where that's taking us, as individuals and as society. Um, and usually the way that the episodes turn out is at the end we go, man, we were hoping to answer one question, and by trying to, we came up with 10 more, right? It and to me, that's what I like, right? I think that it makes me a little bit of a strange fellow, right? But I think people like to believe that they like to know, believe that they know something, right? To me, it's just the opposite. I love the mystery, right? I love that I don't know what happens after I die, or I don't know where the universe came from, right? That's what gets me going in the morning. Um, but that being said, what things we've come the closest to um having some knowledge on. Uh, I think that in general terms, it's really it's mostly science, right? And even that, there's a lot of the problem with science is the categorization, right? As human beings, we like to categorize things. And philosophical and scientific study shows that nature really doesn't fit into categories very well. There's a lot of osmotic boundaries between concepts, even in things that we consider to be concrete reality. Um, but even though you might not know something, um, you can have a pretty good idea of what's there, even if the edges are a little fuzzy, right? And so by and large, there's some scientific principles that come the closest to presenting things that we know. That's our best way of knowing things is science. But yeah, it's a really tricky question.
There's a lot of good stuff in your answer, and you actually touched upon something which I was actually going to bring up in the conversation, and it relates to what I said about being frustrated with what's happening in the world, and it is around the habit which seems to be permeating a lot of society, as I see it anyway, and that is category thinking. And it is, in my view, a fallacy because the position that I'm seeing almost all the time is that you belong to this category, whatever this category is, therefore you believe in this thing or you are this way because you belong to this category. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's paradoxical, right? Because this idea of categorizing things is the foundation of philosophy and science, right? So it has utility, and we've had utility with it throughout history, the ability to observe and to make detailed notes and to say, okay, well, this thing fits into this category, right? That's how we come up with differentiations between plants and animals and between mammals and amphibians and between primates and everything else, right? So categories are important, but we also have to recognize that categories are not the be all end all, right? And that our natural inclination towards categorizing can lead us into categorizing things that don't exist, right? It's really as simple as lying on your back and picking shapes out of clouds, You can find something that's there, but does it actually exist or is it an illusion, right? And so I think that some of the categories that we've attempted to establish in modernity more fall into the sort of fallacious illusions that come from our biases and from the ideologies we subscribe to, and some other positions that stem from tribalism, right? From wanting to feel like we belong to some group or another, rather than the objective reality of the categorizations themselves. So it's tricky, right? We have to realize the utility of the idea, but also just as readily accept the limitations of it.
You make a good point. And I hadn't thought of it that way in the sense that categories are actually quite useful. And I suppose my conclusion would still be the same: is that exceptions apply in the sense that you can't just categorize everyone who and expect them to think a particular way. But if the habit is there because previously it's been useful, that's kind of more understanding from my perspective. I'm going to throw out a question way out of left field or maybe a curveball or something. And I always like to ask this question because I'm interested in learning more about it. And it's about the topic of free will. It is a topic that, philosophers have discussed for a long time, and neuroscientists have, gotten into it, and physicists. What's your take on free will?
Yeah, so historically, there's sort of been two views, right? You have determinism and indeterminism. So people, um, and so the probably the easiest way to illustrate it, right, is the main figures in science think of the universe as being deterministic, right? So they think there's a theory of everything, and that if physicists just knew the initial conditions of the universe, they could extrapolate the way everything will play out until the end of time. And in that scenario, right, time is really kind of an illusion. So rather than thinking of the past and the future, it's a lot easier to sort of think of um, the universe as a rising loaf of bread with raisins in it, right? And so as the universe expands, these raisins get farther apart. But really, your life is just this thing. It's just a raisin in the bread. It's not something that starts and ends. The whole thing is already there. Einstein said it's sort of like a vinyl record, right? Time is just the needle. So as the record plays, we experience our birth and our life and our death. But really, after the record stops playing, the whole record is still there. There's just no subjective eye to experience it. So as a result, it really doesn't matter what I think I'm choosing to do, uh, because of the way that the Big Bang happened and the way that all of the matter spread out and the way things cooled down. Essentially, it all clumped together to make me, and here I am saying stuff that I have the illusion of being free to say, but really, I have no other choice, right? This is the way that it has been prescribed since the beginning of time. And in the end, it will, play out that way. And that seems very unintuitive to people. People don't like that. Um, they like the other version, right? Which is indeterminism, having free will. So the ability I can say, all right, well, I'm having this discussion because I choose to, and I'm actively going through the things I'm going to say and laying them out, which is the way that we consciously perceive our lives as happening. Um, as many things go, it's much more complicated than that, right? And there's sort of an emerging view that blends the two to some regard, which is funny because we think of them as being completely um, diametrically opposed, right? They can't be reconciled. Either things are determined from the beginning of time or there's some leeway for things to change. But in sort of a Hegelian dialectic way that things play out, what we can see is quantum mechanics alters this view of the universe, right? If you use classical Newtonian physics, sure, if you knew the initial states of the universe, theoretically, you could give us the end of time and everything in between. But because quantum mechanics is inherently um, not established, right? So you have the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can know the direction of something, but not the location, or the location, but not the direction it's heading. And the way that quantum wave functions collapse, and the fact that we can observe light being both a wave and a particle, and that our observations retroactively determine the path that something took. Um, there's a certain amount of uncertainty that's built into the universe, which is challenging this notion that, well, if we knew the initial conditions, we could extrapolate on the whole thing. No, no, it doesn't work that way. So if we knew the initial conditions, we'd have a path, but off of that path, there's an infinite number of branches based off of the way the quantum wave functions collapse and essentially change things. So that's on a huge universal level, but on a personal level, right? What I'm doing right now is a little bit different. So we know from certain psychology experiments that the way we perceive the present moment is not the way that we intuitively perceive it, right? Once again, I think that I'm here and that I'm thinking all my thoughts and then saying them on the mic. But really, I'm living in the past, right? My ears, you have 2 ears, and this one will hear something from over here quicker than the one over here, and your brain will take those 2 signals and put them together to make it seem as if you're hearing it at the same time rather than at different times and help you locate things. They did a really interesting experiment with a picture of a bee crawling on a beehive recently, and they tracked people's pupils as they took in the picture and examined what they were looking at. And what they found is that people's eyes moved faster than the brain was capable of comprehending what was being seen. And so as a result, people were living in the past, right? Your visual system is taking in the information and integrating it and kind of putting a filter on it like your phone does, and then presenting you the simplified image after the fact. And so our ideas of things that we're saying, right? For instance, if I continue to talk for another 3 minutes, I might forget the question that you asked. Now, the whole time I feel like I'm in control of what I'm thinking and what I'm saying, but our ability to lose a train of thought demonstrates that it's not really all a choice, right? There are things that are happening that are sort of automatic or sort of unthought of, right? So the consciousness is a very complex system. And so we do have free choice, right? I have the prefrontal cortex says to the rest of the brain and the rest of the body, hey, here's the direction we're going to head. But then the nitty gritty details of execution in your parietal and temporal and occipital lobes and throughout your body um, presents some feedback that sometimes your conscious self has to readjust to. And as a result, yes, we have free will to choose, but there's also a lot less choice involved in the way that we act than we think. So that's a really messy answer. And if you have any questions, I can follow up on them, and I promise I'll be more concise. But that's sort of the big picture of how free will is at the current state in science.
Well, I'm interpreting our positions to be similar, so I guess that's a good thing. I don't think, or I'm not willing to give up complete agency, although I recognize that perhaps we have less than we think that we do. Um, and I think part of the reason is that if you are a determinist, this is my view, and you let me know what you think about it, then you can't really have moral responsibility. You can't take moral responsibility if everything is already determined and you have no choice over it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think this played out in philosophy, the philosophy of criminal justice, but also in psychology. The way that we conceptualize human behavior and human thought now is radically different than it was 20 and 40 years ago, because in the late 20th century, psychology was dominated by deterministic viewpoints. And there's 2 separate ones, right? You had behaviorists who said that essentially everybody is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, as Rousseau would say in philosophy. And all of your behavior, all of it is determined by your environment and all the things you've experienced. And so as a result, you can classically condition or operantly condition anybody into doing anything, given the outside environment. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you had an equally deterministic paradigm, which was genetic determinism, right? Your environment does not matter at all. It has zero influence. Everything that matters is in your DNA, in your genetic code. and there's nothing you can ever do to escape that. You're born with what you have, and that determines how you live. And it didn't take long. Well, I mean, they dominated the the psychological paradigm for decades, but as modern advances in neuroscience came out in the late 20th and early 21st century, it was pretty easy to debunk them, right? There is no, you know, obviously people's genes don't determine their futures. And obviously just the environment doesn't determine the future, right? There's an interaction between the two, and as well as possibly some intangibles, right? And there's scientific experiments we can conduct to parse these things apart. So, yeah, I think that that is a big problem with determinism is the lack of accountability that people the lack of accountability it gives people for their actions and thoughts that obviously on an anecdotal subjective level we know isn't true, but now even at an objective level we can look at it and say no, it doesn't really make much sense to say that something is determined based off of pre-existing criteria in that kind of way.
I'm interested to know what got you interested in psychology.
So the way that one was sort of practical, right? I I took my first philosophy class in community college, which was, essentially free. Got my degree, and then I was going to go to a 4-year school, and I saw the price tag, and I said, I'm not paying for that, and I don't have a student loan. I'm not going to take out student loans, so I ended up joining the army, and then so through the army, got my education paid for. So now, um, since the army makes college cheap, I've done criminal justice and education and interdisciplinary studies, and now I'm onto psychology. The main reason being because I couldn't find any schools that would give you a military discount on a philosophy degree. And so psychology to me seemed to be the next best thing, right? Because there's this sort of feedback loop between the two. Psychology comes out of philosophy, right? We philosophize about human nature, and then that leads to scientific investigations into it. But at the same time, philosophy comes out of the human psychology, right? The human brain. Without the human brain, we could not invent philosophy. So I always liked that sort of interconnectedness that they had. So that's the reason that I'm going to psychology.
Yeah, I am. I don't know whether it's the same for you, but I mean, I'm perhaps not equally interested, but also very interested in psychology as just a, why are people doing what they're doing, and why does this type of behavior exist? So I'm on the same page in terms of how fascinating it all is. I don't know why this question comes to me. I just find it interesting. Either favorite fallacy or perhaps most used fallacy that you like to point out.
Yeah, I think when it comes to psychology, it's the we only use 10% of our brain, right? You hear that a lot. Oh, we only use 10% of our brain. Imagine what we could do if we used 100% of it, right? No, you use 100% of your brain. It's just not necessarily all at the same time, right? You have different brain networks that are active when you're doing different activities. So as a result, um, maybe not all your neurons are firing at the same time, but you make use of the whole thing.
Yeah, I've actually heard that before from a neuroscientist, and I was kind of going along the lines of, for example, ad hominem attack or appeal to tradition. These types of fallacies, logical fallacies. I perhaps I should have said.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think a straw man argument is a big one. That's one you see a lot. Um, that's probably the biggest one where you go, okay, what were you most likely to encounter in everyday life? Yeah, it's probably that one.
Yeah, I almost completely forgot about it, and in some of the debates that I've watched. So there's actually, I don't know whether this is a new thing, so perhaps you can tell me, but I've heard of the steel man. So you ask the other person to steel man the other person's position rather than letting them almost butcher it in the way that a straw man would.
Huh? No, I actually haven't heard of that. I'll have to
So
look that
yeah,
up because that sounds interesting. Eh.
Steel man the other person's argument. Yeah.
Huh.
Is there anything that comes to mind for you in terms of favored philosophical topics?
Uh, y- yeah, man, I just I love them all. You know, we talked about everything on the podcast from the big topics down to you know, Disney princesses and entertainment franchise reboots and things. So that's what we always try to tell people, right? Is that any topic can be philosophical and everybody can be a philosopher. But really the one that is always popping up, and we've actually done just a series of episodes over the past 2 months looking at different aspects of it is time. You know, time is such a weird thing, because it's so intuitive to the human being. But when you start to look at the science of it and how the universe works, uh, it it doesn't it doesn't act the way that you want it to, and it really raises a lot of questions. But yeah, time is probably one of my favorites.
Well, I don't want to go in too much of a rabbit hole, but I suppose the follow-up question I was going to ask is that perception of time, because my layman's understanding is that providing we're all on Earth rather than some, in outer space somewhere, it all kind of acts objectively rather than subjectively.
Yeah, so not really, right? So if we look at relativity, right, with Einstein, space and time are one fabric. And really where you can demonstrate like the weirdness of it is at the edge of a black hole, right? So if time were objective, right? And I was falling into a black hole, um, I would fall in and then I would get, you know, ripped apart at the horizon and die in 5 seconds. And you know, standing back a decent ways, looking through a telescope, you'd see me in 5 seconds approach it and get ripped apart. But that's not the way it works, right? So the way that it works is you standing back in an unrelativistic point would see me in those 5 seconds fall towards the black hole and get ripped apart. Well, that's what I would see as I'm falling in. But you standing back from a point would see me fall towards the black hole, but then eventually I would freeze and I would no longer move. And I'd get redder and redder and redder until I was just frozen, and you'd probably die before anything else happened. I would just sit there frozen. If I were falling into the black hole backwards, what I would see is during those same 5 seconds, all of a sudden, all the stars in the sky would start to move faster and faster and faster. And eventually, you see the whole universe sort of speed up, and millions of years go by outside of it. In your world, it's still that same 5 seconds. So in 5 seconds, you can watch the whole universe die over the course of millions or billions of years because of the relativistic effects of it. Um, and as a matter of fact, if you had a supermassive black hole that wasn't spinning, you wouldn't even die at the event horizon. You could fall all the way into the black hole and possibly survive for an hour or two inside before the gravitational forces would kill you. Um, but yeah, so time is subjective in some regard because in those 5 seconds, have I become billions of years old? Well, from my point of view, no, only 5 seconds have passed. But from your point of view, yes, right? If you and then your children and then your children's children, if your whole lineage manned the telescope and watched, all they would see is that frozen image of me as time slowed down. I would never seem to move, but I would always be there, alive, just frozen. So it is subjective in a weird kind of way, right? And that's just one of the weird aspects of time.
Well, I am fascinated by the answer. I did pre-qualify though, no space talk, so that actually wasn't allowed. Are we talking about is your opinion the same, or I should say, position the same if we're all on Earth?
Um, okay. So you can In the most recent Carlo Rovelli book I read, Carlo Rovelli is a famous physicist who has developed loop quantum gravity, which is sort of a theory that's meant to unite relativity and quantum mechanics. And he mentions in his book White Holes that if you if we could, if it were possible for us to measure in such a minute amount, we could measure the amount of time that's passing as you drop a rock to the ground, right? So the rock is not just traveling through space, it's traveling through time. And so, yes, you and I are in a different time, right? Because we're in different parts of the world, right? So it's 12:42 p.m. Where I am. You might be in a different time zone. Now we're connecting across technology relatively instantaneously, right? There's a lag of some kind, but it seems to be imperceptible to me anyways. Um, but even on Earth, again, our consciousness, right? Our brains, the physical stuff that makes us up does this really good job of making things synchronous, making it one conceptual fabric that we can comprehend. But at a minute level, there is differences in time. There's differences in space. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I would agree. I'd have to think about it a little bit more, but
Am I right in thinking that the answer is it's almost objective, but there are like very small degrees of difference based on kind of what you said about the bee earlier, in the sense that our flawed human brain is making it seem as though it is all happening at one time, but in reality, it's kind of piecing things together.
yeah, I think that's fair, right? We're all exposed to pretty much the same gravitational forces, pretty much the same, environment and things. So any differences in time for anybody on Earth would be pretty minute, I would think.
Okay, well, as we are getting towards the end of the episode, I thought I'd throw an easy topic out there because you mentioned it previously, and that is the topic of God. Um, it's an easy one for us to just close that loop on it. And I kind of
Oh
feel
yeah.
like I have a what do you say, a logical philosophical take on the topic of God. Not necessarily, I wouldn't think that I could determine the existence of a God in any way, but I think it has a logical position on it, and that is in regards to the burden of proof, meaning, can you prove a thing exists? If you can't prove a thing exists, therefore there's no reason to believe that it does exist. So that's kind of my fairly kind of helps my brain with making a difficult topic seem quite easy to determine the answer to. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a tricky one, right? Because God falls firmly into the category of metaphysics, right? And metaphysics simply means things outside of physics. And physics essentially encompasses everything we are capable of knowing. So, very much like you said, God, therefore, is something that is outside of our ability to know. Um, so, there's sort of two consequences of that, right? One is that you, I never, um, I never tell anybody that they're wrong because I don't know, right? Um, there's nothing that says, you know, that there isn't a God out there who is a flying spaghetti monster and created the universe 6,000
I've
years
heard
ago
that
and
reference before.
yeah,
Is
he
that
created the
Dawkins?
I think so. He created the universe 6,000 years ago and then planted dinosaur bones to trick us into thinking it's older and stretched starlight billions of years and did these things. But it doesn't make much sense, right? And it doesn't obey the rules that we've we've we have for the universe, and it doesn't obey the scientific things that we've discovered. Now, I mentioned earlier in the show, right? Science, the the greatest advantage of it and the greatest disadvantage is the categorization, right? The ability to say we know things because we can categorize. And so with with God, right, it's easy for us to say, well, that's outside of something that we can categorize. so it doesn't exist. But I don't think that that's necessarily fair, right? I think that all that really tells us is that science is incapable of answering the question, not that the question doesn't have an answer. Now, I don't pretend that I know what the answer is, right? Um, but at the same time, some some people have a a faith, right? A religious faith in science. You know, it's this version of scientism where science can answer all of our questions, and if science can't answer it, then it doesn't exist. And I don't subscribe to that, right? I think that there is knowledge that is inaccessible to science that is still relevant to the human experience. Um, and so, yeah, God gets real messy, right? God gets real messy depending on what people's view of it is. And even the scientific evidence, right? When you start to look at physics, um, you have a lot of parameters of the universe. They call it the fine-tuned universe, right? Where the anthropic principle, where you start to look at elements of the initial states of the universe and you go, man, if there's a dozens of these parameters that if they were just slightly different, human life would be impossible. We wouldn't be here to observe it, right? And that gets a lot of people thinking, well, okay, well, if the chance of us being here is the same as, winning the lottery or something, it's 1 in 36 trillion or something crazy, well, then there must be a God, right? What other answer could there be? Well, there are other answers, right? There's other answers that one of them is the weirdness of time, right? Okay, so if the chances of us being here are the chances of dumping out a billion pennies and them all landing heads up, it makes you go, well, that's crazy. Like there must be a God that put them all heads up. But if you just spend eternity dumping out that same cup over and over again, eventually they'll all land heads up. It's just a nature of probabilities. So it's paradoxical, right? There's several different ways you could look at it. And I think that I'm not so quick to rule out the the uh the idea of God or that there is a God. I just don't think that it's going I'm pretty quick to rule out the idea that it's going to operate the way that most of our conceptions of it look like. But I don't know, right? And that's the beauty of it is I have no idea. So I can't tell anybody else that they're wrong. And I think that is there a God? Is there not a God? Man, I wouldn't place a bet one way or the other.
A good answer. I liked it. I don't know whether to move on or not, or sort of probe further, but I'd like to get your thoughts on this one, just because it's something where I sort of delved down, and I'm interested to know whether you've done the same. And it's animal ethics, whether or not you've tackled that on your show, or you know, whether or not you've investigated that or not.
Yeah, that's one of our favorite thought experiments to do is with animals, right? Because sometimes that helps clarify the human position on things. We forget that we're animals. We think that we're something separate or different when we're not. And so asking questions about conscious experience or ethics, these sorts of things and how it would apply to um a sea snail, right? Or anything else and versus how it affects us is a very valuable perspective to have. Animal ethics in particular, um, it's a complicated subject again, right? Again, it's more complex than we think. It's very easy for rational people to go, there's a very good chance that these things have much more cognitive ability than we think, a higher level of consciousness than we believe. And this has been demonstrated experimentally. They've looked at dragonflies and they've said the dragonfly is able to predict the location of its prey insect in the air, and it technically doesn't have the computing process capabilities in its brain to do that. So it must be more intelligent than we think it's capable of being, right? And on higher levels, we see it with border collies or dolphins or chimps or elephants, these sorts of animals that, blue whales, they start to do things that appear much more advanced than we think they're capable of. And so that would lead somebody to say, well, then we should, you know, we should really protect them, right? And do our best to take care of them. And I agree with that. Um, but then there's also people that use that as their justification to um, no longer eat meat or consume animal products. And I don't think that that's a bad stance either. I agree with that. But I do like to point out that there's a problem with it, which is that essentially all of life is sustained by other living things, right? And so, even if you're a vegetarian, something has to die for you to live. Something has to die for you to survive. And so I don't think that demonizing the process of life and death um, is beneficial to the lived experience um, so much as the recognition of that life cycle. And so I think that we should do our best to protect conscious and, um, higher levels of consciousness as best we can. But I also think that we need to recognize that we all die. That's just part of life. And so, um, are we ethically obligated to make sure that those lives are as long as possible and are as healthy as possible and as privileged as possible? Yeah, I think that we should be, but it's definitely a concept that's uh, fraught with issues. It's a difficult one.
The complex one. Yeah. I like
Hmm.
the answer. And I'm throwing topics at you left, right, and center, so I apologize. But as I'm asking them, I'm thinking, oh, what about this? I want to know what your thoughts are on this. So the next one is the topic of lying. So is it okay to lie in some certain instances if you're sparing someone's feelings, or should you always tell the truth?
Yeah, well, I like it. This is one of my favorite interviews, just because it has been all over the place. Lots of times you stick on one thing forever, so this one's been fun because it's all over. Yeah, this is an interesting one, and I know that my co-host is gonna listen back to it, and he'll probably yell at me because we have different areas of focus. I like the big abstract topics, and he likes the more humanistic ones. So, is lying something I give a lot of thought to? Not as much as space or time or God. Um, but there are a lot of philosophical positions on it. And one of those positions is that you should always tell the truth. But there's philosophical thought experiments that can be constructed to demonstrate that that's not always the best approach to things, right? And so you're trying to reconcile this sort of abstract view of ethics with the down to earth human experience. Um, and then trying to develop rules on it, right? And so that's where ethics there's always no matter what theory of ethics you pick, there's always a thought experiment that can be construed that demonstrates the weakness of it. Utilitarianism, right? This idea that the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people sounds really good until you have 80,000 people that want to watch two people kill each other in an arena, right? And then you go, well, maybe this isn't working out well. Um, but no, from my own viewpoint, I think that I think that there I don't think that lying is always bad. I think that um, there are situations where it helps human social interactions to um, to either not tell the truth, so lying through omission, or um, in a way that is inconsequential to anybody but a certain number of participants. Um, but I think that you should try to stick to the truth as best you can, which is a really vague answer. But I think that, you know, I think probably a good rule of thumb, right, is this lie going to affect more than me and the person that I'm telling it to directly, right? I think if it has the ability, if that person can take that lie and then it can proliferate through a group of people, then that's probably ethically indefensible, because now you're creating something that is going beyond it. But yeah, in the normal, hey, does this shirt look bad? No, it looks all right. Is that versus, who knows? Maybe there are certain people, maybe if you tell them that their shirt doesn't look good, they don't want to be friends with you anymore, and then you lose a lot of value in the relationship. Yeah, I'm not sure on that one. That one I'd have to think about a little bit more, but
I thought for sure you were going to go with the example of does my bum look big in this?
yeah, I mean that's essentially what is the right answer? I think the right answer is no, right? Is just to but it depends on the person, right? And I think that that's the messiness of being human is trying to interpret not the question itself, but the intent behind the question. Are you asking me that because you want to know before you go out in front of anybody else because you don't want to be embarrassed? Well, then I'd probably tell you the truth. But are you asking me just because you want to boost in self-esteem? Then yeah, I'll lie to you and tell you, So that's the hard part is that human experience is necessarily subjective, both from my point of view and from the person who is being lied to. So those two subjectivities, there's an objectivity, there is a reality out there that we're both trying to interpret, but we both only have our own interpretive lenses. And so as a result, I'm trying to determine what's going to do the least amount of damage and what is going to accomplish a certain set of goals, whatever those goals are. And so I think that it's sort of an ends justify the means sort of thing, right? If the ends that you are trying to accomplish are ethically good, then I think the means of lying are not necessarily ethically bad. But that doesn't mean that it can't lead you into some messy situations.
Yeah, well, I wanted to highlight part of your answer because I think it's often overlooked, and that is it's not just the interaction between you and someone else; it's also how that action can other people looking in on it can you can influence their behavior just by behaving in your way. And I think there's a there's an interesting example that perhaps I'll talk to you after about because I'm probably not going to mention it on the podcast, but it's not just about the scenario, the ethics of the scenario you're talking about is how that scenario will impact many other people. But I really appreciate your thoughts on all this. I threw out loads of stuff that I didn't tell you that we were going to talk about, so it just shows you really thought through your positions. For people who want to follow you or maybe get in touch, where do they go?
I'm the world's worst marketer. So basically, you can Google my name and you can find my music that way. Or you can look for From Nowhere to Nothing. And that's anywhere you listen to podcasts, you'll find me there.
All right, and do you have any closing thoughts for us today?
No, it's been a really great discussion. I think I've loved jumping around from thing to thing. And again, if you've been listening to this discussion and any of these questions have come up and you've thought to yourself, well, I don't know what that answer is, or I don't know what I think about that. Well, that's the importance and the utility of philosophy, right? Is thinking about these things ahead of time so that when you're put in the situation, you have some answer. And obviously, you can't know it all, right? Like as we demonstrated here, I had to kind of work through my position on lying a little bit because I hadn't really thought about it much. But that's the utility of it. Is always taking the time to examine what you believe as it comes up, so that you have a good idea of knowing who you are, knowing yourself.
Joel, thank you for being a great guest today.
Thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.